Check 1 2. Check 1 2. Testing 1 2. Check 1 2. Testing 1 2. Check 1 2. Check 1 2. Check 1 2 2 2. Check 1 2. Check 1 2. Testing 1 2. Check 1 2. Check 1 2 2 2 2. Check 1 2 2. Checking 1 2. Check 1 2. Check 1 2 2 2 2 2. Check 1 2 2 2. Check 1 2. Check 1 2. Check 1 2 2 2 2. Checking 1 2 2 2 2 2. Checking 1 2 2 2 2 2. Check 1 2. Check 1 2. Check 1 2 2 2 2 2. Check 1 2 2 2. Check 1 2. No, I don't. Check 1 2 2 2 2. Check 1 2. Check 1 2 2 2. Check 1 2 2 2. Check 1 2. Check. Check 1 2 2. Check 1 2 2. Check 1 2 2 2 2. Check 1 2 2 2.
got an inspirational thought from Brian Kilmeade's book on Jackson for us?
Well, he's going to come here November 30th.
He is, that's right. I guess I saw the ad on there. That's great.
All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome.
Great to see you.
Welcome to the conservative therapy session.
Whoa!
Hi, Kathleen. Well, good evening, friends. My name is Jeff Hunt. I serve as the Vice President of Public Policy here at Colorado Christian University, and I direct our think tank, the Centennial Institute. We're so grateful that you're here this evening. This is our monthly Distinguished Lecture Series. We bring in a variety of different speakers throughout the year to cover a variety of different topics. Tonight, we're going to explore the future of Colorado and election review, or in other words, what's next when Bernie Sanders and the socialists take over Colorado. Before we begin, we always start with a word of prayer. Yep, there they are. Great, with our 1776 scholars. Please welcome Melissa Holmes and Kendall Patterson from CCU, and they'll lead us in a word of prayer.
Would you bow your heads? Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you that we live in a country that we have the freedom to vote, Lord, and just so thankful that we do have freedoms, and I just pray that you would just bring your clarity, Lord, and I know you have a plan, Lord, and despite all the things that are going on, Lord, thank you that you are the ruler over all, and we just continue to trust in that, and just bless everybody who came out tonight and the speakers, and I pray that you would just speak through them, Lord, and just reassure our hearts. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Will you stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, please?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much. All right, friends, so the way we're going to run this evening is we're going to hear from four of us regarding the elections, regarding what to do next, what's going to happen in Colorado, where do we go from here. And I'm very excited to have my friends. Basically, what I wanted to do tonight was to take the conversations I often have after an election. These are people that I trust and rely upon. I'll oftentimes give them a call and go, what just happened? Where do we need to go from here? And I decided, let's do it publicly. Let's do this together and talk together about what's happening and figure out a roadmap forward. So tonight, we're blessed to have with us Hadley Heath Manning, Policy Director of the Independent Women's Forum. The Independent Women's Forum is an organization based in Washington, D.C. that does a lot of great policy work. And Hadley, they were founded initially as Women for Clarence Thomas, right? So it gives you a sense of their history and what they stand for. So we'll be hearing from Hadley. We'll also be hearing from Frank McNulty, who is the Speaker of the Colorado House of Representatives. He also represents Colorado Christian University and the Centennial Institute down at the Capitol. So grateful to have Frank here. Has a lot of great legislative experience. And then, of course, we have the wise and wonderful John Andrews with us.
Thank you, Jeff. Hi, everybody.
John, I often like to joke that John's the kind of Johnny Appleseed of conservative think tanks. He not only founded the Centennial Institute here at Colorado Christian University, he founded the Independence Institute that John Caldera runs. He founded the Chavano Institute, which was at Hillsdale College. And if you've ever read Imprimis, he was the founding editor, right, of Imprimis, which comes from Hillsdale. Also part founder of the State Policy Network and founder of the Western Conservative Summit. So you can see we've got a lot of great wisdom with John. We wouldn't be where we are today as a country without John Andrews. So grateful to have John here. What we're going to do is we're going to start with a few opening statements. Each of us will get about 5 minutes, talk a little bit about what happened, what we need to be doing moving forward, and then we're going to start to get into issues. Towards the end, we'll open it up for questions, and then we can dive in. So we want you to participate as well. It looks like we've got standing room only. We're going to get some more chairs out, which is exciting. It gives me hope. Oh, we've got 2 chairs right up here if we need, and some, yeah, we've got some chairs around here. So feel free to squeeze in and be a part of this. Before we begin, I also want to recognize some of the leaders here at Colorado Christian University. You know, CCU is in its 9th year of record enrollment. This school is making a big difference. It is a school committed to a Christian faith, but it's also committed to the conservative worldview. And we have a mandate to drive the conservative worldview in the public square. It makes CCU very unique. So I want to highlight some of our Board of Trustees members. We have Don Seeke right there. Don, raise your hand. One of the Board of Trustees members. And Jerry Nelson, I see you there as well. Thank you, Jerry. Any other members of the Board of Trustees here at CCU? Great. Well, we're so grateful for your leadership. This school is exploding. It's exciting. It's a great time to be here, and it's because of your leadership. So thank you very much. All right. So Democrats control the Colorado government. Democrats outperformed Republicans in voting on Tuesday. They control the governor's office, the attorney general's office. They control the Secretary of State's office and the state treasurer. Democrats have a 3-seat advantage in the Senate and a 13-seat advantage in the House. Yet, voters rejected tax increases, regulations on the energy industry, essentially siding with conservatives when it comes to ideas. So what do we do from here? Where do we go? Well, I want to share a story with you. It's one of the stories I hold close in my heart because it has to do with Bill Armstrong. If you remember, the Western Conservative Summit 2015 was began the same day as the Obergefell decision that came from the United States Supreme Court. And the Obergefell decision was the decision that legalized gay marriage. And I remember walking into the Western Conservative Summit, and you could just feel a sense of sorrow among the attendees of the Western Conservative Summit as the U.S. Supreme Court had kind of unilaterally decided to redefine marriage. Well, lo and behold, here comes Bill Armstrong. And Bill walks out onto that stage, and he says, "Fellow patriots, now is the time to mount your horses and ride into the bullets." And you could feel the energy come back into the room. And it was fun and exciting, and we had a great Western Conservative Summit. I think what's absolutely critical is that we remember that we have to fight. We have to fight them on every single action item that they're going to bring. And friends, it's going to be liberal, it's going to be aggressive, and it's going to be progressive, and they're going to start immediately. I saw just on my way in, Channel 7's reporting that they're going to bring forward the red flag bill almost immediately when they get control of the House and the Senate. That was a major, in my opinion, major violation of the Second Amendment. They're going to go after a variety of different issues, everything from religious freedom to higher taxes to higher costs on health care. These are going to be major problems that we're going to face right away, and we have to be ready to fight. Friends, just before this, I went and grabbed some dinner. Anyone see the protesters on Alameda and Kipling? They're out there protesting the fact that President Trump fired Jeff Sessions. Now, what's amazing to me is I have a short memory, but it's not short enough to forget that they all hated Jeff Sessions, and they were calling for him never to be the Attorney General. Now they're all upset that he is being fired from being the Attorney General. So, but they fight. The point is that they fight on everything. They're out in 30 degrees protesting on Alameda and Kipling. They had protests all over the country today. They engage. They take this seriously. They fight, and we need to be fighting every step of the way. Secondly, we cannot rely upon the media to hold Jared Polis accountable. They won't. They didn't during the campaigns, and they're not going to when he's in office. A great point on this. Just yesterday, Jared Polis was on Channel 9 talking about what he's going to do. And he said this: there are some on both sides that have to realize that they need to separate their own individual moral beliefs from what they believe in the public sphere. Now, there is no interpretation of religious freedom in the First Amendment that agrees with that. We've never had a decision from the U.S. Supreme Court that affirmed that position, that you must leave your religious beliefs at your front door, and when you enter the public square, you can have no religious beliefs. That's just not true. And Jared Polis said that on Channel 9. And do you think he got any questions about that? Have you heard the media ask him about that? It's been over 24 hours. Nothing. We have a governor that fundamentally does not understand religious freedom, and he has no questions or pushback from the media on it. Even after the U.S. Supreme Court in a 7-2 decision, including an Obama appointee, told the Colorado Civil Rights Commission to knock it off when it comes to Jack Phillips, Jared Polis still has this mentality when it comes to religious freedom. It's wrong. What we need to recognize, and what Colorado voters are about to recognize, is that we're about to inherit a very big government, a very aggressive government and an overburdened government. And freedom matters in Colorado. It matters to Republicans, to Democrats, and independents. We are a freedom-loving state. So we as conservatives need to talk about freedom. We need to talk about the importance of religious freedom. We need to talk about freedom from government overreach and the importance of low taxes. They're not going to get anything done on roads because they're not going to be able to fund it without raising taxes. So we're going to continue to deal with the same problems that we're dealing with on roads. The Denver Business Journal had 25 bills that the Democrat-led legislature is going to put forth that are going to restrict business. We need to be willing to fight on that. We're going to have higher health care costs. Jared Polis lives in a fantasy land where he thinks if government gets involved, all of a sudden health care costs are going to go lower. We have never had anything ever that has gotten cheaper because the government got involved. It never happens. Why do we think it's going to happen now? So we've got to talk about the importance of freedom of health care, freedom of religion, freedom for all Coloradans. And I also want to point out that, John Hickenlooper is running for president. But I think in many ways, John Hickenlooper was kind of a quintessential Colorado politician, Colorado governor. Because if I asked anybody what John Hickenlooper achieved over the last 8 years, I'd be hard-pressed to find out. There's a lot of shaking their heads in this room. It's hard to figure that out. But the truth is, Coloradans kind of like that. They don't want a government that's going to be overburdening, coming up with a lot of different ideas, trying to oppress them with kind of a Bernie Sanders socialist agenda. And I think Colorado voters are going to wake up to the fact that Jared Polis is not John Hickenlooper. He's got a very different agenda, and that's going to change our lives here in Colorado. We are a freedom-loving state. Finally, I want to encourage you to join the work of the Centennial Institute. All right, we're gearing up, we're ramping up. This is when our battles are fought. It is our job to drive public policy. We are not in the campaign election business. We are a 501c3. We don't pick candidates. We don't get involved in campaigns. We drive public policy, and right now is when public policy matters. So what are we going to do? One, we're going to strengthen our lobbying efforts at the Capitol. You're going to see a more aggressive conservative voice at the state Capitol. Secondly, we're launching a video podcast series because I am so sick and tired of the media ignoring what the left is doing, painting it rosy. We need to go around them, and we need to start talking the truth about what's happening in the state. Third, we're going to be equipping grassroots activists to take action during the legislative session. The Centennial Institute has been very much an events-oriented organization. We need you to be activists. We're going to be setting up a digital platform where you can contact your state legislators and send messages to them. But we need to be active. We need to have a strong voice. Fourth, we're going to be providing new research on important progressive policies. We need to know what their impacts are. And I'm proud to announce that in the coming weeks, the Centennial Institute has been on a big research project, but we're going to announce what the social cost of marijuana has been for the state of Colorado. We're actually going to know what that cost is, and the data is not very good for the marijuana industry. And then finally, we're going to host a Western Conservative Summit in July that is dedicated to strengthening religious freedom and our First Amendment rights. So we're going to have a strong, bold voice, and this comes directly from the president of the university. We're going to plant our flag. We're going to have a strong message to the nation that religious freedom is important and that our First Amendment rights are non-negotiable. We're going to stand strong for them. So that's what we're doing. That's what my plan that I think we need to engage on to get our state heading back in the right direction. So with that, I'll turn it over to thank you. Frank? Turn it over to Frank McNulty, Speaker of the House.
Thank you, Jeff. Okay, we'll do it this way. Hi. Move it back there. Folks, I'm going to ask for a round of applause for the tip of the spear. I haven't heard it said better, Jeff. That's very well done. Thank you. Of course, we're going to need more than one spear, so hopefully some of the rest of you will agree to be tips as well as we start to move into what we have facing us for at least the next 2 years. I don't know that you can look at what happened Tuesday night and say with any sincerity that Colorado is the same state that it was 10 years ago. To say Colorado is the same state that it was 20 years ago. We have traditionally been an independent state, libertarian perhaps, in the views held by both Republicans and Democrats. I do think that that's changed. You cannot, I don't think that you can make the argument that Colorado is a purple state anymore. I think it is, based upon the progression of events over the last several election cycles, we have ticked a shade of light blue. Now that doesn't mean that Republicans can't be competitive in this state anymore. It doesn't mean that conservatives will not have a voice in the policies constructed to lead our state. It does mean that we need to recognize that this is a fundamentally different place than the one in which, for those of us who grew up here, the state that we grew up in, for those of you who came here, the state that you moved to. It is a fundamentally different place. When we elected Democratic governors, they were conservative Democratic governors. Even going back to Dick Lamb, for those of you who can remember back that far. I can't, I'm too young. No, not really. For the first time in our history, we have a liberal governor supported by a liberal state house majority, supported by a liberal state senate majority. And that is going to present challenges across the board. The legislation that they pass cannot be undone quickly, if undone at all. I was talking with a colleague of mine. We went down to the Springs today, had some meetings down there. We were talking on the way down there. And we talked about the last time the Democrats controlled the state house, the state senate, and the governor's mansion, and what they did to attack our Second Amendment rights. And he said, well, yeah, but they paid the price for that. And I said, did they? They have the House, the Senate, and the governorship, and here we are only 4 short years removed from those recall elections that many of you will remember. I think the challenges that we have as conservatives, as independents, as libertarians, is to carry our point forward and to be active, to be activists in the best description of that word. When you look at the vote totals that came out on Tuesday night, yes, Democrats showed up. Republicans did too. The difference between Republican ballots cast and Democratic ballots cast doesn't account for the margins by which Republican candidates lost. We fared poorly with unaffiliated voters, and we fared poorly with suburban women. Arapahoe County was a virtual wipeout all the way down the ballot. Now, there are some who look to cast blame, party leaders, state party leadership, legislative leadership. Folks, I don't think there's any room for that. Some blame President Trump. I don't think there's any room for that. In fact, President Trump really fared better than most modern-day presidents in their first midterm election. The U.S. House, he lost seats, but it wasn't what President Obama lost in 2010. In fact, President Trump picked up seats in the U.S. Senate, nearing historic margins, as I was told here earlier tonight. That was you, right, Barbara? Yeah. Folks, there's a lot to be grateful for. There's a lot to be thankful for. I am grateful for President Trump and what he has done to nominate quality jurists to the bench. I am grateful for the Senate Majority Leader, who has done a remarkable job of moving those nominees through. And if it means that we have to suffer a few electoral losses in the process, then so be it. But we don't have to sit back and take it. And I think that's the message going forward. Our state is fundamentally different. We need to recognize that and accept it. And we need to tailor our work, our activism, to addressing this state that has changed, but one that also welcomes individualism and personal responsibility.
Well, well put.
I actually just listened to your last podcast, Mr. President. That's where that came from. Sorry, Hadley.
No problem. Hi, everyone. I'm Hadley Manning. Thank you, Jeff, for inviting me to be part of this event. Jeff mentioned the Independent Women's Forum where I work. It's a 26-year-old organization. We did start as an ad hoc group called Women for Clarence Thomas. So we were pretty busy this year when the Kavanaugh hearings were, were going on. I do think the Kavanaugh effect was real with the Senate elections. How about that? So my work is primarily based in Washington, although I do live here in Colorado. I live in Denver County. Boy, that's a lonely place. But let me tell you, I've lived in Colorado almost 5 years now, and it is such a special place, and I'm just so glad to live here. I'm like a lot of people, though. I haven't lived here that long. There's a lot of people in Colorado like me who are transplants. And I will say not only is Colorado unique politically because of the moving of people across state lines, but there's been a lot of movement in Colorado, like the rest of the country, when it comes to people's political perspectives. And I'd say my first main point is we have a lot of division in our country. We have a rural-urban divide. If you look at the county maps, not just of Colorado, but every state, you can see where the city centers are, and they're dark blue, and the rest of the country is red. You can see a big divide and a growing divide between especially white, college-educated women and white men without college degrees. I mean, these are two groups that used to be politically pretty similar. Now they're very different, with women moving to the left and men moving to the right. So these are issues that are impacting the country politically, but they're issues here in Colorado too. And for this reason, because there's so much division based on these demographic characteristics and our life experiences, and people are so much more than the boxes we check on a census form, but it tells us a lot about people's politics today, and I think that's sad. I think we ought to, I think especially as conservatives, we consider people first as individuals, people capable of independent thinking, but that's not the way the ground game has gone in this midterm election, because like a lot of midterm elections, it was kind of a turnout game. There wasn't a lot, and this is my second main point, there wasn't a lot of persuasion going on. It was really about people who see the world very differently trying to get their own teams to come out to the ballot box. I want to do a little experiment, if you'll indulge me, and ask the people in this room to raise their hand when I say an issue, if it was your number one issue motivating you to vote in the state elections in Colorado. So I'll start with the economy. How many people thought the economy was the number one issue? Okay. What about immigration? Immigration. Okay. What about education? Okay. What about health care? All right. Okay, so this is it's very interesting for me to see this. Kaiser did a poll of Coloradans ahead of this year's election, so it's not an exit poll, but it's the closest thing that we have, asking people what their number one issues were, and tied for first place at 21% each were education and health care. But there's so much more underneath those top lines. For example, on the healthcare issue, 33% of Democrats said that was their top issue, and only about 12% of Republicans in Colorado said. And that matches with the national trend that although healthcare was the number one issue, nationwide, a plurality of voters, about 41%, said healthcare was their top issue. It was much more motivating on the Democratic side, and healthcare voters broke for Democrats at a rate of 3 to 1. And I think that's primarily because, not only are we disagreeing on the issues, but we're disagreeing about what issues we think ought to take priority. So we're really genuinely, as Americans, living in two different worlds, two different Americas, which I think makes it very hard to communicate and very hard to persuade our fellow Coloradans and our fellow Americans. But I will point out a couple places, points of hope, and that is that in places where Republicans were able to defend themselves, and we don't have to win every issue, but we at least have to come to the table. In states like Indiana and Missouri, where Republicans picked up Senate seats, these were places where nationwide, you know, about 58% of people say they trust Democrats more on the issue of health care, specifically with pre-existing conditions. In those two states, that was fought to a draw. About 50-50 people said, I trust Republicans and Democrats the same on that issue. I think a lot of these issues aren't even really about the policy ideas, but they are signals to voters. You know, health care is one of those where I think especially suburban women, college-educated women are looking at this issue asking, do you care about people? That's really what's behind this. And I spent some time today actually on a website I recommend all of you go visit, called coloradoresistance.org, because it was enlightening to me. There's a manual, they have a playbook, they have a plan, and specifically when it comes to some of these issues, you can just see in the language they're using, and this is true in some of the things that Jared Polis wrote about healthcare. He says, let's get straight to it. Healthcare is a human right, you know, and that's not a policy position really, but it's a principle statement. And it's something that serves as a proxy about, you know, where do you stand on caring for others. And so if we're going to, I hope, bring Colorado back from the light blue shade into purple territory and eventually turn the state red again, then I think we have to think about this battle of ideas differently. We have to be persuaders, and we have to be persuasive, and we have to meet people where they are. So, for example, if there's a number of unaffiliated voters or independent voters saying, this issue is most important to me, we can't come back and say, but look at the economy, man, you know, because the economy is great. Don't get me wrong. But we have to meet people where they are, and we have to at least defend our position on some of these issues that we may not think, as conservatives, are the top issues of the day. So seeing the world through the eyes of some of these unaffiliated voters who, many of them, like me, have transplanted to Colorado, because we do have inroads and we do have reasons to be encouraged. Jeff mentioned the ballot initiatives on the ideas. There's room for agreement. I think we ought to work on our branding as conservatives, because I think that's ultimately what turned a lot of voters off to Republican candidates. But if we can do the education, for example, explaining things like, you know, what does it really mean for something to be a fee? That's something we're going to have to talk about over the course of the next couple years, because Tabor may protect us in some way from tax increases, but if the legislature tries to call something a fee, or when it's really a tax, then our fellow Coloradans should know that, because they've demonstrated on this ballot this year that they don't want their taxes to be increased. And so I think if we can shoot straight with people and explain the issues, come to the table, talk about all of the policy ideas, represent our principles in a way that shows not just what we're against, but what we're for, show that we're willing to fight for people, then I think that we have a lot to be hopeful about. And if you're really down in the dumps, I go back and read The Crisis by Thomas Paine every once in a while, and that always cheers me up.
Amen. Good stuff.
Thank you, Hadley.
No problem.
Hadley, Frank, Jeff, great to be sitting in the grandfather chair on a panel with three of the best young minds that are going to help Colorado come back from the blue precipice that we all went over on Tuesday. And it's great to be back at my adopted alma mater, Colorado Christian University. I want you to think about this. If you want to get a quick scan of issues that will still matter in 6 months or 18 months from now, pick up a print newspaper. If you want the issues that people will have probably forgotten about a week from now, turn on your TV set. If you want to get a temporary buzz from something that will be forgotten in 3 hours, scroll over to Twitter on your phone. If you want to talk about, think about, and do something about the permanent things, as T.S. Eliot called them, the things that have mattered for thousands of years and that will matter centuries and centuries from now, there's one place and only one place you come in the state of Colorado. That's Colorado Christian University. We are gathered, and I don't exaggerate, at a campus that can legitimately be acclaimed as the Hillsdale of the West, or the Harvard of the right, or the Oxford of 21st century Christianity. That's how precious Colorado Christian University is as an institution in this community, this state, and this land. Okay, that's established. Now, I crossed something off my bucket list Tuesday night. It wasn't a happy night, but I was able to cross off my bucket list that nagging question of what in the world did it feel like to be General Custer at the Little Bighorn? Golly, it had barely turned 7 o'clock. The polls were barely closed. All this early voting that we have, voting by mail. And the numbers began to pile up, and they were ugly, and they became a cascade, an avalanche, and I had that General Custer feeling. There they were, coming over the hill, hordes and hordes of them. War bonnets, face paint, tomahawks, bows and arrows. Elizabeth Warren in the lead. But you know, when I saw her, I was about 1,024th panicked about Colorado and American politics in our time. I was not panicked for 3 simple reasons, and I don't have a single poll to cite for you. I don't have a single exit analysis to deconstruct. We can play around with some of that in the Q&A. The reasons I'm not panicked, the reasons I'm of good cheer, I have that fighting spirit that Jeff has called upon all of us to have, are 3 things about politics that have always been true and will always be true about politics, at least in a free society like ours. And here they are. Politics is not war. Politics is not optional. And politics is not ultimate. When I say politics is not war, it feels like it, and we can make Custer and Bighorn jokes, but the fact of the matter is, in this free society of ours, with constitutional government, even with spontaneous restaurant mobs and some of the ugliness that constantly breaks out, the fact is, with our Constitution, the defeated side in an election as a given candidate or as a political party or as a movement of ideas, our conservative movement, is not conquered, let alone put to the firing squad, thrown in the gulag. We're at a disadvantage. The levers of power are largely held by someone else. But we have the constraints of that Constitution within which we can continue to compete. We have the beauty of this competitive 2-party system. It has a safety valve for third parties. It has another safety valve here in Colorado, the initiative and referendum process, the ballot, where, as it's been pointed out, the voters showed their good sense on Tuesday to say no to taxes and no to harsh regulation that would have amounted to killing Colorado's oil and gas industry. And they turned down a number of other things that just were half-baked, to be honest. Maybe they would have been a good idea, this 74, this don't diminish my market value of my property. But the legislative process exists to do things like that. And within the safety valve of the initiative and referendum process, we have something really precious called the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. And thank you for mentioning that, Hadley. And they're going to play games with it. They played games when Frank was serving in the House and earlier when I was serving in the Senate. But we've at least got Tabor. We've got the strongest taxpayer protection in our Constitution in any state. Politics is not war. We're not conquered. We're not thrown in the gulag. We're not deprived of our opportunity to compete. Let's get out there and compete. And in that context, we must never allow ourselves to think of our political opponents and adversaries as the enemy. We just can't do it. It's tempting to say we're going to fight fire with fire. What happens when you fight fire with fire? Everybody and everything goes up in flames. Not us. No, sir. We're not going to do it that way. As Lincoln said, a month from Civil War, and who was he addressing? He was addressing people who thought you could buy and sell human beings like cattle. He was addressing people that would tear this union apart and take up arms against the Constitution. And what did Lincoln say? We are not enemies, we are friends. We must not be enemies. That's another way in which it's important to remember politics is not war. Now, secondly, politics is not optional. Chatting with State Vice Chair Sherry Gibson, former state rep, local government stalwart here in Lakewood, Ramey Johnson, before the program began, we were talking about the fact that Democrats and the left, the liberals and the progressives, politics is all-consuming all the time for them. They have a permanent campaign, and some of the ripple effect has already been cited by what Hadley and others have said about the manifestations. Jeff, striking that they've got those demonstrations. People might be exhausted. They might take the rest of the week off in election week, but no, they had to be out there demonstrating about Jeff Sessions, who they just fell in love with an hour ago. Imagine if Hunt had a store that was open 24 hours a day, a gas station and a convenience store where people get essentials to keep their car going and get that snack and that caffeine and keep going. And across the street from Hunt's 24-hour a day is Andrew's 3-hour a day. Who's going to do a better business? Who's going to attract the customers? Who's going to pile up the profits? The analogy isn't bad. 24 months between elections. Presidential midterm, 24 months. Republicans treat it as a big deal for about 3 months. Democrats treat it as a big deal for every minute of every hour of every day of 24 months, and they just start right in again like those demonstrators that you cited, Jeff, that are upset about Sessions. Naturally, the other side does better than we do. John Adams, writing to his wife when he was ambassador to France during the Revolutionary War, says this: I must study politics so that our children can have the prerogative to study agriculture, so that their children can have the prerogative to study poetry. In other words, Adams understood that somebody had to get in and do what he and his wife Abigail were disinclined to do, which is roll up your sleeves and do politics and take perilous ocean voyages in leaky sailing ships across the Atlantic in order to advocate for this new fledged country that most people didn't think would make it, take all kinds of risks, had to do politics and had to do it whether you felt like doing it or not, because in his case, politics had become war. But the analogy still holds. We have got to see, and I'm glad to know that there's going to be a new activism theme developing here, Jeff, at Centennial Institute. That is wonderful. That is a blossoming of the idea that President Armstrong had and that I helped him implement when Centennial Institute was conceived of a decade ago. We have got to get in there and be a 24-month, not a 3-month per cycle, campaigning force. It's understandable. Democrats think politics is everything. It has become a quasi-religion to them because of the vacuum of religion in the mindset of the kind of people who become liberals and Democrats. And the practical meal ticket aspect of it is they're so dependent on either government jobs or government benefits or government favoritism or government bans on opinions that they happen to find uncomfortable. If you're a Democrat, if you don't win, you don't eat. Naturally, it's 24 months of every cycle for them. What is it for you and me as conservatives, as Republicans, as freedom people? We want to get the politics out of the way so we can get on with all the other dimensions of our life that matter so much to us. It's an understandable and laudable way of looking at it. When people used to say to me, Frank, would I get them White House tour tickets, and I said, I'm not your congressman, I'm your state senator, they would be all apologetic that they didn't know the difference. And I said, you have excellent mental health in that you don't know the difference between Congress and the state legislature. Well, maybe there's a fun laugh in that, but the fact of the matter is we cannot afford that kind of ignorance or idleness or apathy or episodic approach to defending our liberties. We have got to take it up a notch. Politics is not optional. And thirdly, politics is not ultimate. That's why I can laugh when other people are gloomy, because I know how the story comes out. And most of us in this room are here not only because we love America, but because we love Jesus Christ and because the Bible is the core of truth for us. And from that starting point, I reminded friends right after Trump upset Clinton 24 months ago. I had written the talk to console us all in the anticipation that Clinton would have been president, but the fact remains very valid. Jesus was what I would call spiritually lighthearted about politics. At one point, he made a little joke about King Herod, who had the power of life and death over him. He just said, "Tell that fox I'll be doing what I'll be doing." And by fox, I don't think he meant something dangerous. I think he meant something troublesome that could be dealt with. That's politics. It's troublesome, but we can deal with it because it isn't ultimate. Jesus elsewhere made fun of the Pharisees who said, one minute you want me to dance because you're happy, and the next minute you want me to cry because you're sad. When I won't do either one, you're like little children. You're so mercurial. Your emotions flutter around in the wind. Is that us as followers of Christ? Do our emotions flutter around in the wind, or are they grounded in the understanding of what is ultimate? Politics is important. It's not optional, but it's not war, and it's not ultimate. I came across another fascinating flag for this in the book of Isaiah the other day. The city of Jerusalem is besieged from the east and west by two mighty armies. And the prophet Isaiah goes to the king, and he's got the Andrews message. Actually, I guess I've got the Isaiah message. Isaiah says, and this is from Peterson's, the late great, and we will mourn and lament and miss him, the late great Eugene Peterson that went to heaven the other day. His message translation of Isaiah 7, verse 14, says, "Don't panic about those two burnt out cases." That's what he says about two kings leading two armies to crush Jerusalem in a pincer from the east and from the west. Don't panic about those two burnt out cases. There is a burnt out case named Jared Polis. He made a little money as a youngster, all power to him. Then he got excited about politics and he's bought different offices. And he's not bought them just with his money, but with a message of snake oil that won't work. And we should be encouraged that it will fail sooner rather than later. What he wants to do to Colorado healthcare won't be pretty while it's being done, but he's going to have to climb down off it just as sure as you're born. And I agree with Speaker McNulty. It won't be easy to undo some of the damage that will be done in the short term. But these people are going to overreach. They're going to fail by overreaching. They overreached. That's why we recalled 3 senators after the gun rights debacle of 2013 and 2014, Frank. Politics is not war, and they're not our enemy. Politics is not optional, and we better not run a 3-hour-a-day shop across the street from their 24-hour-a-day shop. And politics is not ultimate because who's still on the throne? King Jesus. Let's get down to the issues. Fun to be with you tonight. Thank you.
That was great, John. Thank you so much. I want to kind of dive in, Speaker McNulty, on some of the issues that you think we're going to see. And John and Hadley, please speak into this. They're already talking about red flag bans. I saw that come through. I think we're going to see effort on a conversion therapy ban that's going to rival the work that they've done in California to try to restrict religious freedom. You're sitting in their shoes. What would be some of your top priorities if you have no opposition?
I would hand the gavel over to the Republicans to let them govern the state House and the state Senate if I was sitting in their shoes. I think, let me start by making a couple of points. The Senate Democrats elected Leroy Garcia as their nominee to be Senate President. He is an extremely decent individual and someone who I served with in the state House, and someone for whom I have a great deal of personal respect simply because of the way that he approached the job as a legislator, albeit from Pueblo and on the opposite side of the aisle. And so I think there's an opportunity to have conversations with the incoming Senate President on some of these important issues. The House nominated State Representative from Boulder, State Representative Casey Becker, to be the next Speaker of the House, and that election will happen in January. But there was a great deal of division within the House Democratic Caucus as they came to that decision, so much so that the House Democrats actually had to move back their leadership elections today as they work through some of these internal issues that they had. So as I talk about liberal majorities in the House and the Senate, there are folks within each of those caucuses that understand they have a state to run. And that's the hardest part about being in a majority, is you have to run the state. You have to make sure that the trains run on time. I think the wild card in all of this is Governor-elect Polis. Will he follow his tendencies? Will he follow what he did as a member of Congress representing the 2nd Congressional District? Or will he fall in line with what we would expect to be a more traditional Democratic governor in this state? And I think that dictates what policies happen. It's been said that one of the first bills to come out of the state Senate will be a 2,000-foot setback. Wow. The same, a smaller setback than what voters rejected just 2 days ago. 2 years ago, Governor-elect Polis supported a 2,000-foot setback before opposing a 2,500-foot setback in this last election, and we'll see what happens as this bill comes forward. You talked about conversion therapy. I think that we're also going to see a slew of mental health bills that come through. We're going to see a number of bills to address drug addiction and drug abuse. These are all issues on which we can be a part of the discussion and to be a constructive part of the discussion. But I think that will depend upon how the Democrats approach these issues, whether they want to have that conversation, and whether the governor-elect wants to have that conversation, or whether they just want to take their view on these bills and shove them down the throats of Republicans in the state legislature and half of the state of Colorado. Those are the challenges that we face as we enter into the 2019 legislative session.
John, you were the president of the Senate. What do you see as some of their priorities coming through?
You know, you say that the Democrats aren't our enemies. We always had a saying in the House that the Democrats in the House were the opposition. The Senate was the enemies. So I don't want you to take that personally, but I want you to remember that.
Welcome to the Cave of the Winds, young man. I now have a 30-minute presentation to answer Jeff Hunt's question. Jeff, the overreach that I cited, I think, is a very real possibility. I don't think the Democrats, I don't think this is lost on the Democrats. There is that elation which we saw bursting out with the ill-advised overheard conversation of Representative Nadler at the federal level about impeaching Trump the minute the gavel bangs in January, or impeaching Kavanaugh first, I guess. But that mentality, that intoxication of power will be prevailing day by day as we approach the January gavel for the General Assembly down at the Capitol. But there are also going to be calmer heads. I agree about the man that will take the position that I held years ago of Senate President, Frank Garcia is a reasonable, thoughtful guy, and if I have to do business with the Democrat, give me a Pueblo Democrat. That's every right. time. Pueblo Democrats are the kind of people who pulled the lever for Donald Trump in 2016, by the way. I think that the challenge is upon us, but also the opportunity is upon us to bring data to bear that doesn't have a Republican or a conservative label on it, but just data that cause legislators to stop and think, whatever party label they happen to wear, however green and new they happen to be, however dependent they are, therefore, upon lobbyists. I need to say, from the standpoint of having served down there, we, McNulty, Andrews, some of the others of us, we were, each of us, one of 100 people that were helping make laws for 5 million Coloradans. And the burden bears upon you, regardless of your ideology, your beliefs, your party label, your religion or lack of it. And people are persuadable. I agree with you, and it's a good point. No persuasive efforts were being made during this campaign, but the essence of the legislative process was 700 bills to be sorted out in a 120-day session that just relentlessly pounds forward. The essence is persuasion and being thoughtful and casting the safe vote as a no vote. By the way, that's what our citizen legislators who cast their ballots this week did. They voted no on things that they just couldn't feel too good about. And that instinct is present with Democrats equally as it is with Republicans, with the veterans equally as it is with the rookies and the newcomers, the freshmen. And that is our opportunity. That's why we need the kind of data that you're going to be compiling about the social cost of marijuana, Jeff. That's wonderful. That's why CCU established a think tank in the first place. Our friend John Caldera of Independence Institute wasn't able to be here tonight. That's what Independence Institute excels at. I'm glad that there's organizations and idea development and data development to back up those ideas, headed by people like two guys in the back of the room, my friend Alan Fuller, my friend Michael Fields. Colorado, conservative, freedom, limited government, constitutional advocates are not lacking for these intellectual resources that are going to make it possible for us to have some surprising stalemates on bills that might have otherwise flown through a committee or flown through the floor. The best we can do is to stop things for the most part, but we do have a very real chance to slow them down, get the negative effects mitigated in some cases, give them the two most wonderful letters that can go upon any bad bill in the legislature, P.I., postponed indefinitely.
The only thing I'll add is that, I think there's a couple of issues that we don't talk about very frequently as conservatives that may come to, the top of mind for state legislators now that Democrats have full control. And one of those things that Jared Polis has mentioned a couple of times is doing some kind of paid family leave legislation, which, speaking as someone from a women's organization, we need to be prepared as conservatives to talk about why expanding entitlement, basically state-funded maternity or paternity leave, is actually not what's best for Coloradan families, for working moms. I know this is something that Democrats at the federal level want to do, but part of their strategy is to get sort of to a tipping point where so many states have so many different rules, whether it's mandates on employers or various types of entitlement programs, so that they can essentially flip big business in favor of more government in certain regulatory areas, so that they can go to Congress and say, it's just too complicated for us to deal with this patchwork of different state laws, so let's do a federal thing. And there's also, on the healthcare issue, I'll say we're sort of working with the reverse problem where the federal government has already taken over healthcare. And Republicans fought very fiercely in Congress in 2017 to try to put a repeal and replace bill through the American Health Care Act, actually passed the House, only failed in the Senate by 1 vote. And, it's just depressing that Republicans have expanded their Senate majority now, that it wouldn't depend on Susan Collins to vote for a Obamacare repeal just in time to lose the House. So one of the primary goals of Republicans on Capitol Hill when it comes to health care, because it is so hard to find consensus on this issue, and because we're dealing with certain states, even states that have Republican leadership, and I'll point out that our next door neighbors, Utah, voted in a ballot initiative to expand their Medicaid program. We expanded our Medicaid program in Colorado long ago, but when you're dealing with states that have made different choices about federal money and about some complicated health insurance regulatory issues, the best thing Republicans think that they could get done on health care reform, even now, I think with Democrats owning essentially the House, this may be off the table, but their last best hope was to block grant a lot of the money in the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare and send it back to states and say, within these parameters, you can be in charge of your own health care policy, which from a Federalist perspective is an improvement over the Affordable Care Act. But Linda Gorman, God bless her, she works with Independence Institute and handles the healthcare policy there, would always say in some of these discussions with staffers on Capitol Hill, you've got to include some parameters that prevent blue states from using this as seed money for a single payer system in their state, because we love state innovation, and part of the founders' design is that state governments are closer to the people and can serve the people better. But we don't want state governments to go stomping on individual liberty. You know, the reason we have divided government ultimately is not so that states can have power, but so that individuals can have power and freedom in their own lives. So when it comes to, you know, the healthcare issue, that's one that's sort of divided between federal and state control right now, although I'd say the federal government has made it so difficult for states to do anything different than what the Affordable Care Act says. I would be concerned that with Jared Polis's ideas on health care, that's an issue where we need to learn again to better defend our perspective.
And I think two things on that, Hadley. So Hadley's an expert on healthcare policy. That's one of her areas of expertise at Independent Women's Forum. Help us understand what Jared Polis is about to do on healthcare, and help us as conservatives to have a good response that appeals to moderates and independents, as opposed to, so I sit on the board of the Colorado Women's Alliance, and when we polled independent women this last year, one of their main issues was healthcare. This is one of their top 3 issues. And rather than, and we're in a situation where the costs are going up, but rather than just saying, stop Jared Polis, we need to provide an alternative. So help us understand what Jared's about to do, and then what do you think conservatives need to respond on?
Well,
healthcare?
we've got, you know, I'm sorry again for all the war analogies, but we do have to fight this battle on 2 fronts. And for one thing, we have to have a defensive position against ideas like single payer. And I was reading one of Jared Polis's op-eds about healthcare earlier today, and I just think single payer option is an oxymoron. People need to understand that. Single payer option is an oxymoron. If there's a single payer, there's no options, right? But effectively, in this op-ed, he was outlining what he hopes to do, and I can understand his policy goal. I don't necessarily understand the political practicalities that would have to be in place. He suggests that Western states should band together in a consortium to have a single-payer option, his words, for Western citizens. And I'm thinking, what Western states are you talking about? You have to go out to Nevada and California before you find anybody who wants to do single-payer with you. I know Kansas just elected a Democrat governor, Laura Kelly, who I will say, as a side note, ran really as a pragmatist and sort of a moderate Democrat, as opposed to Democrats who ran in Georgia and Florida, and those gubernatorial races were much more progressive. And I think Democrats right now are sitting back looking at this midterm election saying, we need to at least run as moderates. You know, and I think that's another thing that Jared Polis tried to do. I was watching some local news the week before the election, and there were 2 talking heads, and the Democrat talking head said, well, he's just a libertarian. And as someone who studies healthcare policy, I'm like, yeah, right. No libertarian would support a single-payer healthcare system. So back to the 2-front war. We have to defend against bad ideas like single-payer, because this is something that's not just an issue in Colorado. This is an issue for our nation. It has been an issue for our nation. We have conservatives, have successfully held off single-payer for decades. I mean, this has been the dream of the left for years and years and years, and we've been moving in that direction. The Affordable Care Act was a big step in that direction. But the other front is that we have to explain why the Affordable Care Act also is not the solution. Democrats are divided. I said they were motivated healthcare voters, but even within the Democratic Party, those are the people who say we need big changes to the healthcare system, which I find remarkable, because I would think conservatives would say we certainly need changes to healthcare policy, but the Democrats think so too. So there's really 3 types of people. There's people who don't like the Affordable Care Act. There's people who don't like it for a different reason. They want single payer. And then there's people who are trying to figure out ways to make it work, and that's a tough job. But I would say our job as conservatives is to describe why single payer isn't the best solution, and also the Affordable Care Act. And so this gets down to the key issue in the Affordable Care Act, at least from a political perspective, is the issue of pre-existing conditions. And it blows my mind that people on the left must presume that people on the right are always healthy, our families are always healthy, We don't have friends and neighbors who have serious health conditions because they constantly malign us as people who want to throw millions of people off their health insurance coverage and want to see people with serious conditions essentially locked out of health insurance
Are
coverage.
they hanging their hat on a particular vote, the particular bill that passed the U.S. House or something, Hadley?
Well, they're hanging that hat about the 24 million people on a Congressional Budget Office report that said that that many people would no longer have the health insurance coverage that they have today, primarily because the CBO said those people would choose not to purchase health insurance with the repeal of the individual mandate. And the Congressional Budget Office hasn't gone back to do another score of how health insurance coverage would be affected now with the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, because the individual mandate penalty will be zero in 2019 because the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the Trump tax package, zeroed that out effectively. So back to your key question, Jeff, which I think is, how do we present our perspective on health care? I think we have to draw a very stark difference between wanting every person in the United States to have health coverage and wanting everyone in the United States to have access to quality health care, because they are two different things. I know sometimes they get mixed up. President Obama was an excellent messenger, and he would never say that they were increasing the number of people with health insurance or health coverage. He always said increasing the number of people with health care. And we do it all the time. I say, we get our health care through my husband's job, and we don't. We get our health insurance through his job. But when they say we want people with pre-existing conditions to be accepted for insurance regardless of their health history or even their coverage history, what they're essentially saying is we don't want health insurance to be insurance anymore. Because insurance in any other context is a backstop against unexpected costs. And if you have a serious health condition, those costs are not unexpected. Now, this isn't to say I don't want you to have health care, or I don't want you to have health coverage even. It just means that we're using insurance under the Affordable Care Act to effectively socialize the cost of health care for everyone. So they're already halfway there. They're already halfway to socialize medicine. It's just unfortunate politically because it makes it harder for us to argue against a system where there are still private health insurance companies in place. And most of our healthcare providers are privately owned hospitals, nonprofit hospitals, but they're not state-run hospitals. They're not state-run insurance companies. And so we have to make the case that there's a better solution for people who are chronically ill and who don't have access to health insurance coverage. And importantly, chronic conditions are not the same as pre-existing conditions. If you're in Medicare and you have a chronic condition, then this pre-existing thing doesn't apply to you at all, because Medicare has never discriminated, charged higher premiums, or denied coverage to anyone because of a health condition. And even if you have employer-based coverage, that's also been the case. There were exclusions, but they never said you can't have a health plan. They never said you have to pay higher premiums due to a health condition. This affects a small number of people who are without health insurance coverage and who have very costly conditions. And so I believe the best solution would be for those people to, each and every state, to create focused aid for those people. And we used to call this a high-risk pool. Now, there may be a better way to describe it, but ultimately, it's better for those people, it's better for the sick and the poor to focus aid on them. What Medicare for All or Medicaid for All does is takes programs that were designed for specific populations, the elderly, the very sick, the poor, and opens them up to everyone. So what's ultimately going to happen to those vulnerable populations when we open them up? We're just taking the resources that were intended for those populations and spreading them very thin. And so after you think about it that way, you could see which side is really concerned about the indigent poor and people in our society who are truly vulnerable versus scoring political points.
Right. We've got about 20 minutes, so we're going to start questions now. I want to make sure we get a chance to talk. No, that's great, Hadley. Wait for the microphone because we've got people on the web that are watching and they can't hear your question. Let's do this gentleman here in the middle. Rick, go ahead and stand up. There we go. We'll start there.
We do have people who are ready to wrestle the microphone away from you, so if you try to go all Acosta on us, there's going to be consequences.
It's not necessary. I don't work for CNN.
Right.
So. Senator Andrews, I appreciate what you're saying, and it's very encouraging. We need a spokesman. What we have as a Republican Party in this country is we have a spokesman who we can all look to. We know two things about. He loves this country, and he has our back. We don't have that in Colorado. That's what we need. And when you talk about what's changed, remember 2 years ago, and I don't remember whether it was Amendment 60 or Resolution 60 or Proposition 60, which was single-payer health care. It was defeated by over 60% of the vote. And yet now we have a governor who is run on that issue and was overwhelmingly, I shouldn't say overwhelming, 7 or 8 points elected.
Yeah.
So we need a spokesman. And I suppose it could be the Centennial Institute, but that's my concern with what's happening in our party, is we don't have that person. Help us. What shall we do? Where can we go? Who can we look to that we can say, okay, you speak for the conservative message. Does our party even have a conservative message? And if so, what is our conservative message? Jared Polis started this campaign 2 years ago by putting an infrastructure in place in every county in the state. He had $25 million, God bless him. Interestingly, he earned it in the capitalistic system, which now he hates, but it's a whole different, that's a different issue. So I'm going to give the microphone up and leave you with that question.
Well, now, John Anders ran for governor once before. I think we could get him back out there to run again, right?
Oh, Jeff, I can't. I have a chronic condition. It's called being born in 1944. Thank you. You're very kind. You know, we're going to have to see who steps forward to pick up the fallen flag. It's a great question, and I think you put your finger on something that will be needed to rally in the short term around legislative battles that will come in the spring, and in the longer term to get us ready to compete again in 2020 and 2022. Does George Brockler turn the page? He almost ran for governor this time. Of everybody that was running this cycle, Brockler is the best messenger. He can fire up an audience. And maybe to give you another name, and I don't think it's going to go this way, but conceivably Mike Hoffman wishes he had run for governor instead of running yet again in a district that they'd stacked against him to defeat him, and they finally defeated him on the fourth try. Mike Hoffman has been Mr. Republican in this state for a quarter century. Does he still have some political juice left in him? Right now, he's licking his wounds, and he's probably feeling pretty exhausted. We owe Mike a debt of gratitude for representing us so well in Washington over the last 10 years. Even when we disagreed with his vote, nobody else could have held that district as well as he held it. Those are two names, Brockler, Kaufman. Who else comes forward? I don't know. I like Dan Kaplis on the radio. He's back on the radio officially as of this week. Dan has had the itch to run for public office for a long time. He's on KHOW in the afternoons at 4 with Krista Kafer. It remains to be seen. There's two things in my notes that I failed to voice a moment ago for us to keep in mind. As we absorb a real thrashing that Republicans took in Colorado and some disappointments that we took across the country, although it was much more mixed, as both Frank and Hadley pointed out, but here in Colorado, remember these two things. Adversity is opportunity, and success is temptation. And so for our side, defeated but not thrown in the gulag or put before a firing squad, we can compete again. And we have the opportunity of our adversity, of being driven into the wilderness and see what voices come forward to begin to lead us and rally us and develop the themes and get it down to the kind of basic, visceral connect with lots and lots of people who never thought of themselves before in our camp, such as President Trump has done so masterfully for whatever are his shortcomings. So adversity is our opportunity. And meanwhile, for the other guys, as I've said several times, success is their temptation. You just watch. It's going to turn. The details remain to be seen.
Great. Next question. We'll go back over here. Mr. Brandon Yates, CCU.
Thank you very much.
Student.
It is. Thank you very much. My name is Brandon Yates. I'm a senior at CCU, and my question goes to the issue of persuasion. So I think you're very insightful to point out that when it came to candidates, Colorado broke very hard blue, but when it came to the ballot propositions, they broke very hard red. I was very grateful in particular to see 112 go down in flames. So how do we orient voters, especially millennial voters, my peers, to focus on issues and ideas as opposed to candidates and personality? Thank you.
Go ahead.
That's the million-dollar question. I think this year is a $5 billion question. I think our congressional elections were the most expensive in history. Oh, man. We've got some issues with young voters and with female voters, with unmarried voters. And part of the problem is that the focus has been on personality. And while many people in this room may be very much enthused about our current president, he's unique, and he's a unique political variable. For Republicans to try to assemble a coalition that is not the Trump coalition during a year like this one, only 2 years after the president has won, and mind you, Colorado even, before President Trump clinched the nomination, I mean, I was there. I caucused at my neighborhood level and my district level, and I went to Colorado Springs for the state caucus. Were other people there? Mm-hmm. Okay, there was not a lot of pro-Trump support. There were a few people, but the overwhelming sentiment among Republicans in Colorado in 2016, before he was the nominee, was pretty negative on Donald Trump. And this is a challenge, not just here in Colorado, but nationwide. With younger voters, with voters of color, and with female voters. And I think we just have to focus on not just explaining the principles of our ideas, but for the skeptic, we have to focus on the results of our ideas. And that's easy to do with the economy. It's harder to do in other areas where Republicans haven't had the opportunity to implement the policies that we want to do. But I think if you're a skeptic and we're saying, just trust us because our ideas are right because they're based on natural law and they're based on other things that people may not know about or agree with us about, it's harder to make the argument. It's easier to win the argument and persuade people, I think, when you can say, look at what has happened. Whether it's a bad policy, and we can look at single-payer healthcare systems or socialized medicine, in other parts of the world, or whether it's the right moves that I believe Republicans have made on the economy here in the United States. We have to focus not just on the ideas and the principles that undergird them, but the results that follow them.
And I think, Hannah, the other important point that you made that struck me is we need to meet people where they are. Mm-hmm. We need to talk to them about the issues that they care about. As conservatives, as Republicans, we want to convince. I want to convince, but I think we need to take a step back and understand that we need to do a better job of meeting people where they are on the issues that they care about, and then visiting with them about opportunities to help improve their condition, regardless of what those issues might be, but talking to them about those issues and meeting them where they are.
I'm going to make one more comment. I hope this doesn't get me in trouble with this audience, because I have the same worldview and agree with everybody on this panel. Everybody should be judged by the content of their character, nothing else. But when I received the mailer explaining who I should vote for the Republican slate in Colorado, it was all white men. And I don't think that should be the most important thing. I don't even think it should be the thing. But the left has been pretty successful convincing people that identity politics is the thing, and that their brand is inclusivity. And if you look at the results from this election, who's headed to Washington, who's headed to represent people, especially people with D's after their name, it's a pretty diverse crowd. And we do have a lot of diversity in conservative circles, not necessarily running for office, but maybe that's an area of adversity that we can turn into opportunity and recruit more candidates who look like the rest of America, because we have them. We have a lot of conservatives who look like the rest of America. We have a lot of diversity on our side when it comes to not just ideas, but all those other demographic characteristics. But getting those people to be our spokespeople and our representatives, I think, will be a challenge, but an important thing for us to try to do.
As a white guy who's had his name on the ballot, I agree with you.
Teresa.
That mailer is going to go in the Hall of Fame of bad political marketing, Hadley.
Teresa Seidbotham from Teleoslaw. You talked about a number of initiatives, and some of them are blatantly unconstitutional. Do we have plans to take these battles into the courts?
What are you thinking of that's unconstitutional?
Well, we've talked about potential Second Amendment violations. We've talked about some serious First Amendment religious liberty violations. We've talked about limitations on commercial speech potentially, the mental health stuff, parental rights with 14th Amendment. I mean, I could go on.
Well, I was misled when you said initiatives. I was casting my mind backward to what we just decided on the ballot. You mean legislation that could be brought in 2019? Yeah.
Right. As you're talking about the initiatives that will be brought, do we identify?
Our friends at Independence Institute have a law center that is gearing up to litigate issues like that. It's not as well resourced as it needs to be, but it's the beginning. Around for a long, long time and doing heroic work, mostly on land use, environmental, and energy issues, based here locally, a couple miles from here, Mountain States Legal Foundation. Religious liberty issues, CCU has had to think about defending its own identity for several years now, and is very well wired in with Alliance Defending Freedom out of Phoenix and with the Beckett Fund out of Washington, D.C. So the opportunity exists to litigate some of these things. You can't litigate what hasn't been legislated. They talk about ripeness, of course, and so the time has got to come, but when the time comes, we're not empty-handed. Jeff, you can probably elaborate on that.
I think that's a need in Colorado, and I think the attorneys need to be ready, and if they're willing to put forth volunteer opportunities to help fight these cases, I think that's going to be very important. So I don't know if the Federalist Society is that strong here in Colorado. I've been to a few of their events, but we need a community of conservative lawyers that are going to stand by and do the work. I'm not an attorney. I'm married to an attorney. But we need help in that space, and I think having a good community of lawyers is going to be very important. So Christian Legal Society, Federalist Society, I think they need to be ready. I think you're exactly right, Teresa. Back there, sir.
I'm J.B. Wasotsky.
Hold on real quick for the microphone.
Thank you. I'm J.B. Wasotsky, and my question is regarding the fact that 4 years ago, Coloradans voted for a Democrat governor, but they voted for 3 Republicans for Secretary of State, Treasurer, and AG. And this time, even with, I think, amazingly qualified and appealing candidates like Wayne Williams, George Brockler, and Brian Watson, Coloradans didn't split their ticket. They went for all Democrats. And I was wondering what your thoughts are about that.
It wasn't the same Coloradans who were voting. You know, the Coloradans who voted 4 years ago and who turned out is different, is what I'm saying. And the Democrat wave, I mean, this is a typical thing for the president's party to lose seats in a midterm, but these folks were really fired up. The folks on the left were really fired up, and they captured a lot of, as you mentioned, Frank, unaffiliated votes in Colorado as well. So I would just say that, you know, maybe the voters who voted 4 years ago thought the same thing and agreed with you about the candidates, but there were other people voting this time too, and that's what I think made the difference. That's my analysis.
So you think it's who turned out to vote this time versus 4 years ago?
I would be interested, and I haven't seen any analysis on this yet, I'd be interested to know how much of a turnout driver the Y and Z fair maps proposals were. I favored them, and I think we're going to be very glad when we face an all-Democrat state government in 2021 that we have Y and Z with a fairly random and blind approach to drawing maps that are going to give our side, Republicans, a much better chance. But it's quite possible that the unaffiliated voter turnout spiking in Colorado this year was in part due to the heavy promotion of Y and Z and the new feature whereby unaffiliateds have got 1/3 of the seats on each of these two 12-member commissions, 4R, 4D, and 4U. There's a guy named Kent Thiry who is president of the DaVita kidney dialysis healthcare giant. he wants to be governor. He almost ran this cycle. Frank, don't you think he has his eye on it in the future? If not governor, some job.
Yeah,
now, the governor's job is occupied for 4, arguably 8 years. Hope not 8. But theory is Mr. Unaffiliated Empowerment in Colorado. It was by his initiative and dollars and organizational drive that the opening up of the primaries was passed with 108 and 109 2 years ago. That I think is not a good idea, but it's a coming thing of the future. There is a new virtual, unorganized, unled political party in Colorado called the U's. In my county of Arapahoe, they're by far the biggest power. It might be true in Jeffco and elsewhere across the state. And they're coming, and this guy, Kent Theory, is someone to keep your eye on.
Yeah. All right. Barb. Hold on, we got the microphone. You're right in the middle, so they got to figure out which one's coming.
Thank you. I'm Barb Monarch with Colorado Family Action, and my question is, have you looked yet at how much the Republicans were outspent and where the Democrat money came from? Because we are not a self-enclosed state. We are being influenced by progressives all over the nation, and we are the testing ground to launch this in other states.
I think that's something to be seen here soon. I talked to Walker Stapleton this morning about being outspent. I mean, and it could be anywhere from 6 to 1 to 8 to 1 on what the Democrats outspent Republicans on. So that'll be analysis to come soon. But I think it's important to watch that. You know, we've all a lot of us are familiar with the blueprint, which is this idea that you know, some handful of people with a lot of money can shape the state. I think we're continuing to see that, and we need to be wary of what type of influences they're trying to bring, special interests that they're trying to bring here. Back there in the back, we'll do last question. Give me that mic. Give me that mic. Not to Randy. Randy's all right. Randy's already got a show.
You've mentioned education as being an issue.
Yes.
Good point to that is that gal on The View who saw that they lost the U.S. Senate because of gerrymandering. But education is a big issue, and particularly in the next generation behind us. And I wonder tonight, real quick, are there any pastors in the room? Anybody pastors at church? Thank you. Yeah. My work is to communicate with the pastors who speak to more people on any given weekend than anybody else in the country. And so I guess I want help in putting that in people's mind as to how they can talk to their pastor and work to get education into the church, to talk about worldview, biblical worldview, because in the church we're woeful in that area, and really bring civics in one way or another to the church. And then we begin to have a conversation with pastors, because in the congregations are righteous men and women who we need running for office, right?
Yep.
And then, you know, if Polis raised up organizations or offices in every county, 64 counties in Colorado, I think there's more communities peppered throughout these counties than anything else, and we can work through the churches to make those communities righteous one by one, networking across the state and changing the landscape here. I want to push that out. That's the work I do at the Family Research Council, is work with pastors in this Watchmen on the Wall initiative. And just put that in your minds out there. How can we get to the pastors, bring the pastors around tables in counties across the state and begin this process of education?
And you're exactly right. I think there's a real problem with pastoral engagement on the civic issues that we're facing. I'll give you a great example. Pastors every Sunday are telling their congregation, you need to live your faith 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, no matter where you are. You need to practice your faith. This is not something that just happens on Sunday. So Jack Phillips runs a business, and he practices that. And Jack Phillips is drugged before the state of Colorado. He loses 40% of his business. He engages in a 6-year legal battle that culminates with a 7-2 victory at the U.S. Supreme Court and there were almost no pastors standing by his side. That's a real problem. It was ADF, it was groups like Family Research Council, but we've got to get that type of engagement, and pastors need to recognize that that the people that are sitting in their seats are facing real challenges from this government that's seeking to restrict religious freedom, and they need to have a strong voice. John?
Say your name, sir.
Randy Wilson.
Yeah, Randy, would you just stay there by that door and let folks, after we adjourn, come on up and give you their contact information if they want to help you network into their churches?
That would be great.
Yeah, let's go see Randy when we finish, friends.
Absolutely.
Can I share one anecdote about this? Because I was driving through Denver, this was during the Kavanaugh hearings, and I drove past a church, I kid you not. Their church bulletin sign, and this was obviously a left-leaning church, said, "Believe women." And I had to go back because I thought, surely this is about Mary Magdalene. I thought, surely this is there's a Bible verse underneath it or something, and this is just a clever way for this church. No, it was a political statement. And I was so disheartened and I think a lot of people are turned off by the idea of having politics in our churches. But I think that there's a way to do it right, and I appreciate your work, Randy. But I just wanted to share that because I thought it blew my mind that the churches on the left don't seem hesitant at all to tell people what political views to espouse.
You know, Adam believed Eve, and it's all been downhill from there, Hadley.
We're gonna close here, but I want to do one last thing here. You know, we have our positions, we have our policies, and they're important to us, and we fight in the public square for them. But when someone raises their hand to run for office, they embody those positions, and they go forth and they receive a tremendous amount of hate, of people that rip apart their lives, their families, their careers. They look for ways to bring them down in every possible way. It is very hard to run for office. Do we have anybody that ran for office in this last election? Stand up. Stand up. Let's give them a round of applause. We need more people like you. So thank you for fighting for the values that we care so deeply about and putting yourself out there for that. That is not easy. I want to make a few announcements, and then we'll break up here and we'll hang out if you want to chat for a little bit. On November 30th, we are going to host Brian Kilmeade in this room from Fox and Friends. He's going to be talking about his new book. Brian Kilmeade is one of the hosts of Fox and Friends. If you have to pay a ticket, and when you pay the ticket, you get a book, and he's going to sign those books here, take pictures. It's a great opportunity. You can find that at centennial.events. That's centennial.events, and come. That'll be November 30th, right back in this room that evening. And then, Hadley, you mentioned this, but December 10th, we're going to host a panel discussion on conservative solutions to paid family leave and early child care solutions. So how can we provide good market-based ideas to deal with that? We're going to have experts from the American Enterprise Institute here, as well as Patriot Voices, which is Rick Santorum's organization, talking about that. That'll be December 10th. So with that, let's give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you very much. Fun to be with you. And carry on the fight. I know we came in from the elections a little down, but I think there's a lot to be optimistic about. So thank you all. God bless you all. We'll see you in a few weeks. Thanks.